Well, thank you and welcome. Thank you all for coming. I see some familiar faces and some new faces in the crowd today. We are pleased to be here to talk about how to build back better in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. My name is Andrew Holland. I'm Director of Studies for the American Security Project. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan national security think tank doing a whole range of issues. But one of our core issues has been around resilience and energy, climate security, and we've actually had a long-running program on what's going on in Puerto Rico. So when this hurricane was coming in, we thought we need to get out here and talk about what we've done and what our experience can add to this debate and hopefully give some perspective on how to build back better. We'll have three speakers here today. First will be to my right, Dante Disparte. Dante is the chair of American Security Project's Business Council for American Security. He's a native of Puerto Rico and the founder and CEO of Risk Cooperative. He is also co-author of a 2016 book, Global Risk, Agility, and Decision Making, still available on Amazon. Go get it and read it, and you'll learn a lot about a lot of the stuff that we will be talking about here today. Up second will be Brigadier General Stephen Cheney. He is our CEO, my boss. He was the Inspector General of the Marine Corps, and his final command was as Commanding General of Parris Island down in South Carolina. No stranger to hurricanes in that region. And then I'm Director of Studies here at ASP, but I'm also, my research area is on energy and climate and how they relate to national security. And so I will pull up in the last. We're gonna each talk for about 5 to 10 minutes, give our perspective on both what has happened, why it's happened, and more importantly, what comes next and what we need to be doing as Americans, as a country, as business people, as national security leaders, to ensure that this ends up not being a complete tragedy, but perhaps something, the beginning of something new and better. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dante, and we'll go from there. Dante, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, General Cheney and American Security Project, for staying long on the issue of Caribbean energy security, resilience, climate change, and a lot of uncomfortable subjects, especially in a city like this one, when what we've had over the last 2 months are real stark reminders of our humanity and real stark reminders of the motto of this country, which is, out of many, we are one. Each one of the events that I'll describe in a moment, and then we'll really focus in on Puerto Rico, does not recognize party, does not recognize wealth, does not recognize where you live and how you live. So we have to recall the country now is facing disaster fatigue. Just on the heels of Hurricane Harvey and the largest rain event in recorded history in the United States, Hurricane Maria destroyed much of the Caribbean. There are islands in the Caribbean that are uninhabited by people for the first time in more than 300 years, the island of Barbuda. So this concept of climate change refugees is here and now. It's not something we have to wait for in a far-gone conclusion or in a far-off future. It's happening now. Then you had that same hurricane system devastate much of Florida, the entire state, in fact, parts of South Carolina and Georgia. And Irma was the most persistent and most powerful Atlantic hurricane ever recorded. So we need to stop discussing climate change and replace the word for the present, which is climate changed. And what are we going to then do about it as a country, not only for our citizens, 3.4 million of them on the island of Puerto Rico, but our neighbors. We have an obligation as a country with the type of military prowess, economic prowess, and entrepreneurial ingenuity that we could bring to bear on these issues to do much more than we're doing now. And so, focusing in on Puerto Rico, where I'm from, and this, usually I sit here and I speak in the abstract, but today I will not, because not only are all of these things that I write about and trade about with my company coming home to roost, this time it's personal. So in 1989, Hurricane Hugo destroyed my house. I was 12, not to date myself. And from that point forward, it completely devastated my mother's ability to hold our household together, and I never lived with my family again. Had to grow up real fast. And I could only think back to a hurricane as devastating as Maria, a direct hit over the island of Puerto Rico, which was at once already vulnerable, and we'll talk about that for a few seconds, but it was also the staging ground for relief efforts in other Caribbean islands that had just suffered the consequences of Hurricane Irma. Puerto Rico was quite literally the center of relief efforts for our neighbors. And so we should take no comfort that our response as a country has been slow. And we're not here to criticize, we're here to call for action. And I think this rallying cry of Build Back Better really establishes what is the opportunity in Puerto Rico. So leading up to where we are now, 3.4 million American citizens facing up to 6 or 8 months in darkness, a complete humanitarian crisis of national proportions. The entire infrastructure, whether it's water, communications, or electricity, has failed. The hospital system barely worked before this crisis hit, certainly is not working now. And so while the initial body count was low, and I don't think that a body count is a proxy for what is a good disaster or a bad disaster, we shouldn't be ranking them in that manner. While the initial body count is low, the consequential losses already is in the 30s. 30 people have died so far, and many of them are dying from things that would otherwise be preventable, but for the lack of the ability to take people to functioning hospitals. The fuel supply has been crippled. So there's so many preventable illnesses that are going to really already are taking a massive toll on the most vulnerable, the elderly, people with chronic illnesses, and children. Before Maria hit Puerto Rico, there were 1 million people without electricity due to Hurricane Irma before it, 60,000 without water. That number today without water is around 50% of the island. And we should not forget that Puerto Rico is ground zero for America's municipal debt crisis, with a debt burden of around $72 billion. Think of that as a share of GDP per capita on the island. It's a debt burden that is Greek in its proportions, and there is nothing we could do about it, save for here in Washington, D.C. And so this argument of Build Back Better would be almost a moot point if we didn't also hone in on the reality that building back better requires pre-investing. And part of the pre-investment strategy, of course, is debt forgiveness and figuring out how do you lift things like the Jones Act, which I'm sure we'll talk about at length in this panel. How do you take these 1920 relic legal sort of rules like the Jones Act that not only cripple the cost of shipping, it also hamstrings the total number of vessels that could sail to Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and U.S. overseas territories at a time when we need every form of disaster relief. To be able to say it only could be a U.S.-made or U.S.-crewed vessel, it's compounding issues and adding insult to injury on the island. So all that to say, we have an opportunity here. I think this narrative of Build Back Better creates a case story where instead of our southernmost territory, the island of Puerto Rico, being a basket case that is forgotten, and where 3.4 million American citizens are left to themselves, and our motto of out of many we are one means nothing, we have a chance to get this right, and getting it right in the long term, I think, becomes a very compelling investment opportunity. There's an investor named John Paulson who has put his own capital, about $1.5 billion, into Puerto Rico, and he's made the reference that Puerto Rico could be the Singapore of the Caribbean. And I think that is true. We have a competitive economy. We were once the gem of the Caribbean. We have a competitive workforce that is bilingual. We have the ability to trade not only across the Caribbean, but across the United States and Latin America and elsewhere in the world. And getting Puerto Rico back to that Singapore of the Caribbean vision requires really taking this crisis and the reset button that this crisis has effectively created on the island and its infrastructure and its people, and turning it into an opportunity. And that's what this discussion at American Security Project is all about.
Cheney, over to you.
Thanks. Did you not tell me earlier your sister is there on the island?
Yes, if I can, let me give you the report. Not only, again, there's so many moving parts. So my entire family is on the island, right? Save for the ones that live with me in D.C., my brother, my sister, nephews, nieces, et cetera, there. Having spoken to my sister this morning, she lives in Old San Juan, a block away from the Capitol, from the mayor's house, or the governor's mansion. And they still do not have access to clean water in the supermarkets, right? So this is, almost 3 weeks after the hurricane struck, this concept of it's okay and the body count is a proxy for, this wasn't a real catastrophe and we should be thankful, that really, really misses the mark. The situation on the ground, and this is in the Capitol, is there is no potable water coming from the taps, and there is barely any water, if at all, in the supermarkets, and that's the report from just a few moments ago.
Well, Dante, there's nothing better than on-the-ground report from somebody who's credible, and I've not been there recently, but she's there now, so we wish the best for your family. And I might add, the American Security Project has a board member, Alejandro Brito, who is there also, who has a business, who has survived okay, but the business has not. So we're working with him as well. As Andrew said, I'm the CEO of the American Security Project. I've been with the organization now as the CEO some 6 years. We were founded by 4 senators, Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman. We were delighted to announce on Monday that then Senator, now Secretary Kerry is coming back to our board, so we've welcomed him back. It kind of got drowned out a little bit with the events in Las Vegas. But we have a board reunited with the exception of Warren Rudman. God bless him. He's in heaven. But I'm pleased to have those 3 members back, and we will, in fact, be doing an event with Secretary Hagel on the 25th of October, if I remember correctly. Andrew kind of laid out what we do. We're a nonpartisan, non-political. We want to take the national security perspective on a variety of issues, and there's a huge intersection here between energy and climate and national security. And we've been discussing Puerto Rico for a long time now. Andrew kind of anecdotally said I have experience with hurricanes. I'm going to detail 2 of those experiences for you. My first was as commanding general at Parris Island. And it's an interesting job when you have that there because you're also responsible for recruiting for half the country for the Marine Corps, and included in that recruiting district is Puerto Rico. And I will tell you, Dante, you'd be pleased to know, perhaps my most favorite and most productive recruiting substation was San Juan. And they were a subset of the Miami station. I never had a problem making mission. In fact, I had recruiters want to go there all the time. And I went down there several times. So the patriotism of the people was exemplified by those who wanted to join the Marine Corps and who did join the Marine Corps, and we were pleased to be there. When I took over Parris Island, my predecessor pulled me aside and he said, you're going to have 2 really big problems here. And I said, really? And he goes, yeah. He says, the first, we have a personnel issue with one of our people, and we dealt with that. He says, the second's going to be hurricanes. Now, this was June of 1999, and I kind of laughed. He said, but we got a good plan in place in case we have a hurricane. 60 days later, Hurricane Floyd took dead aim at us, Category 5. And it was a real experience for me watching us go through that whole drill when we had 8,000 recruits on deck, an island that's 10 to 12 feet above mean sea level, predicted storm surge 20 feet. You do the math, we weren't going to survive. So as it took aim at us and we looked at the percentages, we were waiting a declaration of emergency from the governor because I had to move 8,000 to 10,000 people some 150 miles in fairly short order if we didn't do it quicker. And I was waiting on Governor Hodges, didn't declare a state of emergency till late. Finally, I said, to hell with it, we're going. So we flooded the highways with 300 buses. It was a phenomenal traffic jam. And you can imagine the logistics of it, moving that many recruits and Marines. We moved them to the logistics base in Albany. The food, the fuel, the supply, the bivouac. You just imagine the magnitude. That's just 10,000 people. Think about 3 million people in Puerto Rico. It just gives you a little bit of an idea of the magnitude of the devastation that they've got and how it's so hard for DOD to get a foothold and do what it's doing in Puerto Rico. But we lived through that, and I will add, they had another Category 5 take AMN last year, had to go through the whole drill. We were fortunate in that the hurricane Floyd did not actually hit Parris Island. It glanced us. We had some moderate damage, but it went up to North Carolina, and when it hit North Carolina, it was Category 2. And you think, well, I don't remember Floyd that much. Well, I remember it well. It knocked out Route 95. Everybody here knows 95 for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Route 95. This is in the continental United States in North Carolina, one of our major highways, was closed for 2 weeks because of flooding from Hurricane Floyd in North Carolina. So put that into context as to what's going on in Puerto Rico and think of the road damage and how they're trying to clear roads there. We couldn't even do it here in the continental United States. Now we're trying to do it at an island. It is really, really a difficult time. And my last anecdotal story, I moved on from my career and took over as president of the Marine Military Academy in a town called Harlingen, Texas, which is not far from South Padre Island. And sure enough, the hurricanes just followed me everywhere. And they said I'm bad luck in that, but the summer of 2008, July 2008, we had Hurricane Dolly coming. Now, people perhaps don't remember Dolly too much. Ike followed Dolly not far after and hit Houston after that one. But Ike stalled on top of Harlingen, Texas, and dumped 21 inches of rain on our campus. And it just devastated the campus. I mean, we were flooded everywhere, took out all the power, and this is now the state of Texas. We were without power for 10 days. 10 days in the state of Texas. So the magnitude of this, and I think Andrew has a story of how when Irma was coming up the coast, he was driving up north along with all the Florida license plates and headed south were all the utility trucks. You don't have that in Puerto Rico. You're not driving to Puerto Rico. And the people aren't leaving either. So this is a really, really hard problem. I'm not here to defend the Department of Defense. My personal opinion is they were slow off the mark. Understanding they had some other complicating events, not the least of which were Harvey and Irma, and moving assets around, trying to protect and defend and rescue people from those two events. But this was a Category 5 dead shot on Puerto Rico. We knew it was going to be devastated. I mean, I think everybody in this room looked at it and said, oh, this is really, really going to be bad. So I think they were a little bit slow off the mark. Now, DOD has great op plans and prepared for these types of catastrophes. They do it all over the world. Admiral Locklear, when he had Pacific Command, had to put up with Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. He moved 12,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines down to the Philippines and helping that rescue effort. Now, I'm not into the body count business, but they had 8,000 people killed in the Philippines on Typhoon Haiyan. I mean, it was a devastating. And the only people who could respond to it at that level of logistics was the United States. Here we are with our own territory in our own country off our own coast, and we're having a little bit of a lot of difficulty getting the right amount of logistic support into that island. Now, understanding it is tough. Those roads are desolate. You got to get the roads cleared first before you can drive a truck on the roads. I know the optics don't look good when you see all the container ships sitting in the port, but if you can't move them down the street, they're not going anywhere anyway. I mean, again, the optics. I'm not saying it was fake news, but I tend to sympathize some with the DOD, and plus that, I might add, it starts at the local level, then it goes up to the state or territory level in this case, then it goes to the federal government. And you've got to work hand in glove with all those people, and it is a very difficult mission. DOD has ramped up now. I'm not going to recite all the statistics. They literally update them by the hour. You can go online, get it off the DOD website as to how many are there. I think this is not going to be, oh, we'll be there for a week and we'll be gone. We'll be there for months, if not more, down in Puerto Rico, trying to establish law and order, put up power, get potable water, protection, shelter people. I mean, it is a very, very difficult issue. One that, again, could have been a little bit foreseen. Now, here at ASP, we've been talking about climate change and catastrophic weather. And I do a pitch all over the country talking about this, and Admiral Titley, who's the head meteorologist at Penn State University, used to be the head meteorologist of the Navy, will tell you there perhaps is not a direct link to the frequency of hurricanes and climate change, but there certainly is to the intensity because of ocean water temperature that's going up. And we see that all the time. I mean, when you talk about Irma having the highest wind velocity in the Atlantic, Haiyan had the highest wind velocity of any hurricane or typhoon in the world when it struck. And we're just going to see more of those, and they're going to happen. And ultimately, down the pike, we kind of know what causes climate change. It's CO2 put in the atmosphere. We just stopped doing that, but that's not the topic for today. I can get into that if you want me to. But that said, I think the DoD is ramping up faster now, and I won't say it's going to be okay, because we got a long ways to go. So with that, I'll turn it back to Andrew.
Steve, thank you. You know, I think both of you have laid out kind of both the challenges and what's actually going on. And I'm going to take just a couple minutes to talk about, well, what's next? What's the recovery and reconstruction? And kind of, actually with apologies to Adam Siegel, one of our adjunct fellows, who has a paper that you can pick up outside on what he calls the 4 R's. Traditionally, it's 3 R's in disaster relief and recovery. So it's relief, which is life-saving and getting minimal functions going for preserving life and reducing damage risk. Recovery, helping society move into a functioning stage. Reconstruction, measures to boost economic and social strength to pre-disaster levels. And then he's got a good point. Add a 4th R to this, and it should be resiliency. It's the measure that helps contribute to the potential for reducing future risks, and we could have what he calls a grand slam. Go pick up his paper after we're done. It's worth reading. But here in Puerto Rico, you know, the reconstruction part is so important because, as General Cheney said, we know there's going to be more hurricanes coming. This is the Caribbean. It's a feature of the Caribbean, is hurricanes. Unfortunately, a feature of today's climate is that the temperature of the seas are warmer. We don't know when or where the next hurricanes will strike, but it seems to me that there are definite win-win possibilities to both address the underlying competitiveness issues in Puerto Rico, the things that have been driving, you know, residents off the island for over a decade now. Puerto Rico hasn't seen economic growth since 2006. This is not, you know, some short-lived recession. This is a 10-year, essentially, depression that it was caused by a whole number of things, and, you know, we could go through all of those as well. But you know, when you have a debt crisis like Puerto Rico has gone through, it's 2 sides of that. It's borrowing, yes, of course, but it's also a lack of growth. When you have a lack of growth and you have this uncompetitive economy, then you know, of course, it's not to say that Puerto Ricans are uncompetitive, because we know that there's millions of them, like Dante, here in the United States, who are entrepreneurs, who are, you know, creating businesses and wealth all across the United States. It's an asset to the United States, and it's unfortunate that it hasn't been able to help the debt crisis on the island. So when we look at those things, there's 3 things that I think we need to think about going forward to be able to rebuild that sort of resilient economy. And I kind of break them into 3 different areas. So first is policies that we can do. What do we need to do in Washington to change policy to increase competitiveness? Second is financing. How do you get money to Puerto Rico? How do you, in an area where people are leaving, money is leaving, money's going to Wall Street to pay down the bondholders, and then third is investment. So how do you get people to drive money back in there, and you know, what do they invest in? So first on policy. Dante said the Jones Act, and this is one of the so clear and obvious policies that should be changed. And you know, I was talking to a reporter last week, and he said, "Oh, the Jones Act's been fixed. They did a 10-day waiver," and it's like, as Dante points out, it takes that's one round trip. between Puerto Rico and Jacksonville. So it's like, so what? You can get the recovery, the relief materials there. You can get the aid there, basically, but you're not going to get the reconstruction going there. And so that means that that reconstruction will be that much more expensive. Studies have said that the Jones Act makes everything on Puerto Rico 30% more expensive than other islands. Think about that. 30, just add, you know, if you go out to the store and, you know, getting a gallon of milk for $2, suddenly it's $2.60. You know, it adds that much more to everything. And, you know, when we're rebuilding an island, why should we add 30% cost onto every building material that will be going into there? Every sort of, you know, whether it's steel or wood or anything like this. It's just such an obvious fix. Of course, I'd say, you know, we shouldn't need the Jones Act in a globalized world. But, you know, if we're not going to change that, you can at least do an exception for Puerto Rico. Already, the U.S. Virgin Islands have an exception. So there's no good reason to keep that. Second, now, of course, is financing, and we can talk more about this as well. We know that there are over $70 billion in debt, and there's just no way that that's going to be paid off. It is going through bankruptcy right now. They're renegotiating debt. They're having haircuts are being taken by the bondholders and everything like that. And I would note that yesterday the president said that Puerto Rico's debt would be wiped out. Unclear what that means at this point, and I think I saw also in the news that OMB Director Mulvaney said, no, there's not going to be any bailout. But I'd note that the benchmark Puerto Rico bond dropped yesterday from 44 cents on the dollar to 32 cents on the dollar. So that's a sort of market statement about what they think is going to happen going forward. So there is some sort of changes happening. But, you know, there's just, we don't want to rebuild in Puerto Rico only to create more debt, more unsustainable debt for the island. So another policy based here in Washington that we can and should do immediately is that there's a FEMA cost share for federal aid to states and territories and localities. Congress can and should immediately waive that FEMA cost share for Puerto Rico. You know, this is we don't want to create more debt and we don't want them to not do something that's important and necessary simply because of fear of the debt burden. But ultimately, you know, kind of the solution here is to make Puerto Rico a place that people want to invest, a place that folks want to go to. And one last thing, and then I'll kind of get off the stage and we can discuss more of this further. One of the prime reasons that Puerto Rico is uncompetitive, beyond the Jones Act, beyond, you know, all the other things, is the cost of energy. So you look at Puerto Rico, and it's not only it's about 4 times as expensive per kilowatt hour for electricity on the island of Puerto Rico versus Florida. So, you know, why would any sort of manufacturing company that has to, you know, use a good bit of electricity locate on the island when they could just locate in Florida? But even more than that, some people would say, well, that's just a factor of being an island. And yes, the electricity in the Caribbean is more expensive. But Puerto Rico is even still the most expensive electricity in the Caribbean, which is, and it's not like PREPA has some great reputation for providing always-on electricity. You talk to, again, our board member, Alejandro Brito, he says, well, all of his businesses have backup generators. And, this sort of thing is really, should be an easy fix. And there's two ways to do that. One is investments in, alternatives to fuel oil, expensive fuel oil that's being shipped via Jones Act tankers or from outside places. And then the other is, the renewables revolution. Solar is hugely cheaper now than it was even 5-6 years ago. And we can and should be making those investments into a place where the sun's going to shine, the wind's going to blow, and it's just an easy fix, and it's only 1% right now of Puerto Rico's energy mix is renewable versus the other kind of United States island, Hawaii. It's 15%. There's no reason that there's no policy reason for that. Anyway, I'd like to have kind of a conversation among us here, and then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion going forward. Dante, what do you think is kind of the policy options here in Washington? What do we do going forward?
So, and thank you for, I think, laying out a good case for Build Back Better and what are the policy, economic, and other options that we have. We shouldn't forget a couple of other points that matter, right? Back to the kind of human element and not to speak in too many abstractions. Puerto Rico is poorer than the poorest state of the Union. Mississippi has that dubious distinction for the continental United States, and Puerto Rico makes Mississippi look rich. We earn $20,000 on average per household, and then you throw in a compounding effect of a 30% price increase courtesy of the Jones Act, and then you throw in a 4%, if not higher, cost per kilowatt hour than the US mainland. We're almost deliberately strangling the people of Puerto Rico.
That's right.
And if you had any doubt of their patriotism, as I think General Cheney alluded to, I'm happy to take people on a walk to visit the Vietnam Memorial to find out, the value of a Puerto Rican life is just as important as an American one, and yet we are carrying on with a series of legacy policies that have no place in the 21st century. I take no pleasure, and neither does General Cheney or anybody else with the American Security Project, in having to see the military deployed in the fashion that it is being deployed. The reason being is that this is the costliest of interventions we have. By the time the military is stepping in to rebuild, whether it's in Houston, Florida, San Juan, or anywhere else, every other line of defense has failed, right? And so this is the costliest of interventions you have in an economy. And if you want to be a resilient 21st century economy, you have to start building resilience at the household level. And that is not only about construction and prevention and preparation, but it's also about recovery, it's also about economics. And so everything we're talking about here, it's not about abstractions, right? It's about real people affected in real time, and yet we're responding to 21st century crises almost in an analog fashion, right? We're almost kind of working our way through, and do you have this document and this clearance to get the FEMA mobilized? Let's also recall, FEMA needed an 11th hour line of credit from Congress to respond to Harvey. We had $1 billion in FEMA's budget. This is irresponsible, folks. In an era where climate risks do not recognize borders, political lines, and other, Houston had and Texas had 3 500-year flooding events each year for the last 3 years. And we have a federal emergency management agency with $1 billion in its budget, well before. And so it wasn't but for that line of credit, this emergency line of credit, boosted FEMA's resources to $15 billion, that all of a sudden we had a little bit more money in FEMA's coffers. We're not ready as a society for the types of risks that are facing us. And so I think what happens in Puerto Rico and how the United States responds foreshadows what is going to happen with the rest of the country. Our infrastructure scorecard nationally is dismal. Our level of human readiness is dismal. And the types of threats we have to face, whether they're thrown at us by Mother Nature, terrorism, domestic issues, biodefense and epidemics and pandemic risks. None of these things check in with Homeland Security or at the TSA. And so this concept of Fortress America that I think has sunk in to a lot of our policy-making apparatus is really, really dangerous. And you and I and 3.4 million American citizens in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands should not be forgotten, or our other neighbors in the region, are foreshadowing what the rest of our world looks like unless we really, really do get ahead of these issues with great urgency.
Yeah, I think that's right. The vulnerability of islands almost makes them kind of the first canary in the coal mine, as it
Right.
were, or something like that. They're the ones that you have to deal with it first, and if you can't deal with it there, how are you going to deal with it in a larger and that much more complex and difficult situation?
Right.
You know, Andrew, anecdotal story, but there is one that's an analogy here, and it's Okinawa, Japan, and I've spent several years there, but they had a bit of a catastrophic event in 1945. After the war, there was not a single building left standing on the island. And we took it over and we rebuilt the whole island and then turned it over to the Japanese in 1972. But my point being, in the years that I was there, typhoons were a regular occurrence. Even ones category 4 and 5, never devastating to the island because they rebuilt in the right way. They had cement, reinforced, they know the drill, they've got great infrastructure. And by the way, the island is thriving phenomenally, and the southern half of the island is heavily populated. So it can be done, it can be done, and we've got to do it in Puerto Rico. And if there's any silver lining to this, it's maybe there's a chance for debt relief, and maybe there's a real good chance of building better infrastructure here and getting onto renewables. So, I mean, to cast a brighter light on what's a very, very sad situation, here is an opportunity we can't let pass
Exactly.
up.
Well, and if I could add one more
please,
quick point. The other piece that really does matter, and I think comparatively speaking, Puerto Rico is lucky. Had this same event occurred in Haiti or in the Dominican Republic, we'd be describing thousands of people dead and a much more devastating effect on infrastructure. But the other piece of the puzzle is Puerto Rico has suffered one of the largest non-conflict related human resettlements. More than 500,000 people have left Puerto Rico in the last decade, courtesy of the debt crisis that Andrew has described. So one of the other unintended consequences of Maria is that it will complete this mass exodus from the island. And so when you're sitting here with this debt burden that is completely unsustainable, and Washington, I think, is a little conveniently ignoring the fact that we've got to do something constructive with it, and we have to do it here, the tax base and the revenue base is shrinking as we speak. Anyone who can get off the island facing 6 months or more in darkness will. And so we also have to deal with this enormous, not unlike Katrina, the Gulf displacement of people from the Gulf is not dissimilar to what we're seeing in the Caribbean. And these are regions of the world with very distinct local cultures, language, food, and other culture that is almost being lost before our very eyes. And so again, the human toll is not an abstract point.
Yep.
And while many states and communities on the U.S. mainland have been gracious, school systems in Florida saying that they'll pay in-state tuition for Puerto Ricans who move there, we haven't contemplated this in terms of local budgets and local resourcing, an influx of our neighbors because towns and cities are being leveled all around the country, right? Not to mention other forgotten crises, whether it's Flint, Michigan, and many others. We really do have some inconvenient issues we have to confront.
Yeah, and they're leaving, right, because there's no jobs for them. The people who are leaving are the ones who most want to and need to work. So they're leaving to go to the United States to find a better job to support their families. The silver lining here, again, in the resilience and build back better narrative is that construction and energy and these things that you'll have to do to build back are actually quite jobs heavy things. So there's jobs to be had if you can get the financing and investment moving in that direction. So there's opportunity here as well. It's not like you're going into some place that you're going to have to be importing labor. There's labor that wants to work and wants to build back better. So I think there's clear opportunities there. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions around the room. Please wait for the microphone to come to you because we are filming this and we want to be able to hear who you are. Phrase your question in the form of a question, not a statement, and please identify yourself. So I think sir right here, and then we'll go to you next.
Paul Gallagher, I'm with the Executive Intelligence Review News Service.
Great.
With respect, I don't think any of you have talked yet about rebuilding anything in Puerto Rico. So let me ask you about to respond on four things. First of all, Puerto Rican Reconstruction Authority, formed in 1934, organized in 1934 by President Franklin Roosevelt after two very, very major hurricanes hit the island, the worst of them in 1928. Built that dam that finally cracked 2 weeks ago. Secondly, after Houston, in the Houston Chronicle, a biographer wrote a very useful editorial, What Would Jesse Jones Do? In other words, if we had a Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a national credit lending institution, what could it do to prevent our cities from being devastated because they lack flood control infrastructure that was planned 50 years ago and never built? Thirdly, the debt crisis, which is now being dealt with, it's being dealt with by the President of the United States. He has started with a federal guarantee, which was refused last year in the act. With a federal guarantee, the debt of Puerto Rico could certainly be reorganized over a much longer period of time at much lower levels into a bank, which would develop Puerto Rico. And finally, on what I think you didn't discuss, what should be built? Starting with the Port of the Americas at Ponce, which is smack on the Mona route from Gibraltar to the Panama Canal, which the largest ships take and which it cannot handle, the largest ships, and now it's been damaged in addition. But its landside infrastructure can't handle that. That is a tremendous development for Puerto Rico, together with rail. It does not have, the island doesn't have a single mile of railroad. So that's certainly 400 to 500 miles that needs to be built. And power, 4 gigawatts of power have got to be built, because here the main generation facilities are knocked out, not just the distribution, but the main, which were no good to begin with, and we're burning oil, are also knocked out. So I'd like to ask what you think of those, I mean, of actually doing something which would change the situation of a totally indebted, totally discriminated against, totally legislatively crushed island.
So if
Yeah,
I may,
please,
I mean,
yeah,
well,
and
one,
I'll-
thank you
I'll
for
have some
calling that
thoughts,
out, because
yeah.
that's what we were hoping to get to.
Yeah.
The step one, hard to build and revitalize an economy when you have such a crushing energy cost, both in terms of distribution. If Puerto Rico was an independent country, we wouldn't have any qualms at all about talking about things like privatization, right? And taking state-owned enterprises that underperform. PREPA, last I checked, contributed around $12 billion to the public debt burden. Anywhere else on the planet, we would talk to the World Bank and the IMF, and we would privatize the heck out of it overnight. And with it, you would figure out, of course, how to create an energy matrix that incorporated things that are a little bit more ubiquitous,
Right.
and where the cost per kilowatt hour is level or more competitive than
It's more
traditional
resilient.
fuel, right? And so you would incorporate solar, you would incorporate businesses that had generators. We worked on a project in Puerto Rico with one of our partner firms, Tropigas, to do cogeneration facilities, right? To take the commercial base, which we have a large commercial base on the island, and to put a cogeneration plant right next to them to smooth out the cost per kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
Part of the challenge in doing that at scale is the regulatory environment. The grid and the authority doesn't want you taking commercial clients off the grid. That's a rule that stands in the way of creating an economically competitive island or environment.
crazy.
So things like that are easy to strike out of, the stumbling blocks that stand in the way of rebuilding and building back better. Things like that can be removed readily. So I would privatize the public utility. I would incent and remove any restriction whatsoever to creating a distributed energy matrix that incorporates things like solar and a whole host of alternatives, including cogeneration, because it's an island. There is no energy panacea, and there is no centralized model that ought to work on an island like this one that simply relies on importing fuel. Because with or without the Jones Act, a hurricane this devastating would have still created a bottleneck on fuel. And so more renewables present would have meant more people could get back online and get their lights back on much more quickly.
Yeah, and I just...
It wouldn't have knocked out the fuel for a nuclear plant.
Nope.
That's right, but...
Perhaps, but then ask the Japanese how they feel about the Fukushima event, right? Well, it's a fair point, but there is no energy matrix without an external consequence.
I would say ASP fully supports nuclear power and thinks it's an important part of it, and the challenge is that it's such a centralized power.
Well, that and so incredibly expensive.
So we have to work on that. I'd say, when I was working on in the Senate, I helped Senator Hagel write a bill to create a national infrastructure bank, and that's about financing infrastructure, financing these big infrastructure projects of regional and national significance. And I still think we need something like that as a way to incentivize financing into infrastructure. It shouldn't be, a federal government role, maybe not even a local government role to, rebuild the houses or apartment buildings or things like that were harmed in Puerto Rico. But it is about infrastructure, and the key reason that Puerto Rico, I think, was uncompetitive is a lack of infrastructure, a lack of good, strong infrastructure. You talked about the trains, you talked about, the dam, and an energy grid is a key part of a 21st century infrastructure. Sir, here, you had a question. Right here.
Thank you, Brian Barnett with the Barnett Company. And I had a question on how do you incentivize or raise the responsibility factor for local and regional governments, right, to take that on? And so I'm thinking that whether it's financial, so that you don't get yourself in a debt squeeze, right, or if it's building codes, which would be local, or in this case maybe national. So how do, and thinking that, like hurricanes are coming, like the last X hundred of years, so you're thinking, okay, this stuff is going to happen, right? Not maybe, or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of degree. So how do you all see how you prepare individuals, localities, counties, states to take on that responsibility financial? Because I could see, well, if you're in debt there's no way you can have a rainy day fund either. That's right?
Yeah.
So given that this is the norm, so I'm curious kind of how you inculcate that so people are like, okay, bring it on, as opposed to living a life of fear.
Right, yeah, and that's the challenge for places that are in debt and impoverished. It's one thing to say, how do you incentivize Lower Manhattan to be more resilient? Well, there's a lot of money there, and they can figure out ways to protect Lower Manhattan. It's the poorest area of the country also happens to be online for that sort of stuff. So it's a real challenge.
One of the bodies of work we worked on with American Security Project and Lloyd's was to launch something called the City Risk Index, which looks at the economic cost as a share of GDP exposed in cities to different types of threats, man-made, natural, and emerging. And when you start to put an economic cost or a dollar value to a catastrophic flooding event in Houston, and what share of GDP of Texas was exposed, if not the entire country, to the fourth largest city in the United States being underwater, it starts to cast a new light on what does resilience mean. And so even in a Houston, as with California, very predictable, large catastrophic losses, we're underinsured for them. Something like 11% of households in California have earthquake insurance as a standalone thing. The flood insurance programs nationally are underfunding, woefully underfunding and underpricing these risks. And the private insurance market is doing very little, I think. So, the short answer, Brian, is we're entering a world where we have to begin pre-investing. It's kind of an invest now or pay later proposition, but either way we're going to pay. Puerto Rico's debt burden, invest now or pay later, but either way we're going to pay. It doesn't just magically disappear. And when you have all of the conditions that we've described up front, how do you flip it on its head? And so if you stretch any investment horizon out long enough, the investment proposition becomes palatable. Then you could tackle some of the things this gentleman raised in terms of infrastructure and energy and ports and things like that. But who has the balance sheet to do that today? There's only three actors: the state, and we're already nearing the 11th hour of our own economic debt clock, the long-term asset holders, insurance companies, pension funds, and others. These are the only folks with the trillions of dollars of capital to tackle these big questions. But if they don't do it, it shows up on their balance sheets in these shocking events. The last 2 months will cost the insurance industry upwards of $200 billion. So you're going to pay for it no matter what, right? Or the taxpayer pays. And so every time we pick up the tab for a predictable risk like these, it's a market failure, and we should really drive a lot more incentive.
Yeah, man back here, I think that's right. I could add more, but don't need to.
Hi, I'm a fellow at Refugees International, and I have two questions. One is on displacement. Do you know the displacement figures? What are the plans for protracted displacement, and will the government pay for people to come to the U.S. mainland? And my second question is, how is assistance being prioritized, or how do you think it should be prioritized? Thanks.
I don't know the numbers. I've
either.
seen 100 to 200,000 predicted over the next several months. I don't think the U.S. government's going to be paying for that.
So there's about 8,000 people, last I checked, currently in shelters on the island.
Yeah.
Luckily, the housing stock is largely made out of concrete. So, while much of the housing stock has been destroyed, I think some of the, fixing roofs and things like that is underway. But there's about 8,000 people or so in shelters that have been immediately displaced. But there's many areas that are completely inaccessible, right? And so with a hurricane like this was a mile below a Category 5 hurricane. The communities that are in the mountains that are landlocked, that don't have potable water, food isn't arriving, all of these folks are going to effectively move into the San Juan metropolitan area. So there's a lot of internal displacement, let alone the fact that the second we get the airport fully operational again, there will be a lot of out-migration to the U.S. mainland and elsewhere. So I think the number will complete we will completely sort of remove the middle class, what was left of it, on the island of Puerto Rico. There's a growing call for, the U.S. Comfort has arrived recently. It hasn't necessarily docked anywhere on the island, if I'm not mistaken. But there's a growing call to get medically vulnerable people off the island because the healthcare system isn't working. Out of 70 hospitals on the island, I think fewer than 10 have electricity. And so there's a growing call for, this is still in the acute humanitarian phase.
Yeah.
And so we are trying to be somewhat forward-looking about Build Back Better, but right now we're still trying to save lives. And that's where I think what the general was describing earlier about slow off the mark has been costly in terms of putting lives at risk.
There was a cruise ship that was due to be taking a cruise out of San Juan, but instead of taking a paid cruise, they took I think 7,000 people to Florida, where they could receive better medical care and this sort of thing. So yeah, people are being displaced. But what's ironic is that unlike in, say, some of the real refugee crises in Europe, for instance, or something like this, from the Middle East to Europe, is that it's the people with the most means, or people with the means, are the ones that are leaving, not the poorest. It's the ones who can afford the airline ticket, who have skills and have marketable job prospects are the ones who are going to the United States, to the mainland, to do this. Ma'am here, and then we'll go to Sir back there.
Hello, thank you. My name is Maureen Coates, and I am a two-time evacuation survivor of hurricanes in the Battery Tip of Manhattan, of all places.
Yeah.
One of the most important things we've been doing in the wake of climate change influenced storms is to alter our floodplain maps. And we're seriously rethinking programs like Build It Back in New York in the wake of Sandy, which has gotten nowhere in the last several years. We, in addition to thinking about how to build it back, we're also thinking about whether
Right.
to build it back. And we haven't talked about that yet, that for many, many centuries, if not millennia, human beings did not intrude into certain ecosystems on the grounds that the air, land, and water capacities, coupled with the air, land, and water systemics, were not conducive to human operations. And now that we have the climate changing again, and as severely as we know it is there some room to start thinking hard about, essentially human zoning, if you will, in a macro sense?
Right.
Are there places humans should be rethinking whether they really ought to be, and then consequentially, if we decide to be, what it's truly going to cost to manage a risk from the natural and physical interactions that are going to ensue?
If there was any one good thing about Puerto Rico being hit, it's got elevation to it. So the storm surge wasn't the big problem there. It was the wind and the rain and the elevation. Unlike St. Martin or Barbuda or some of these others that just get wiped out, people will live, in my opinion, in Puerto Rico forever. I mean, that's their home. They'll go back. You might say it's going to be hit by another Category 5 hurricane next year. They're staying.
I wasn't necessarily asking about Puerto Rico specific. I'm asking
Right.
based on the kinds of policy activities your organization is.
Go ahead.
Well, if I could add to that, I'm doing some early stage work, but work nonetheless with Conservation International on this very set of issues, which is, our first true line of defense. If you want resilience by design, you look to nature. Mangroves exist for a reason, and they're nature's way of saying storm surges are real, and we will adapt. Barrier reefs are really pretty darn good when you have your island is being affected, as are mountain ranges, which Puerto Rico, being mountainous, spared many communities of the worst of the wind. And so I think this, one of the problems of trying to externalize, rationalize, and create an economy around big, complex natural events is that we create moral hazard. Not to get too sophisticated, but the people bearing the risk don't bear the cost of the risk that they bear. Why do we continue building back with bricks and sticks in Tornado Alley? Why is our flood system and insurance system on floods the way it is? And effectively incenting folks to go back exactly the way they were. The principle of the core principle that drives the insurance market is indemnification. I will get you back to the state prior to the loss. But that's the core question you're asking right now. And enough of these disasters are occurring back to back to back. These are all extraordinary century, millennial type events that have occurred in 2 months. We have to ask these core fundamental questions about what are we doing with our coastline. In Florida, for example, why are we continuing to build in places that already today you land an aircraft anywhere in the state of Florida and you're seeing water seep up, right? Climate change, go long on climate change, short underground parking on Florida. That's my stock tip of the day, right? But resilience by design is sort of the opportunity you've described.
I'd add, I'm a big fan of cities. People like to live in cities. I like to live in cities. There's an inherent resilience in people concentrated together. It's easier to talk about an electricity grid. It makes economic sense to bury power lines when you're concentrated together. When you've got a sprawling metropolis. Now, I don't want to indict Houston or anything like that, but Houston is the definition of American sprawl, and building into floodplains, building into areas that perhaps should have been left as prairie land. And I think New York it's been a really interesting thing to watch how the New York local governments and New Jersey local governments, philanthropy groups, and the private sector have kind of come together and determined, well, what areas should be built back, what areas should you build dunes. You know, it was this really interesting sort of natural experiment on the Jersey Shore. You know, which communities had dunes and which didn't were the ones that survived and didn't. So these sort of natural resilience things, of course, I think agree completely. Sir, here.
Hi, I'm Bill Hook. I'm with the American Meteorological Society across the street.
Great.
So building on your comment, Andrew, just a second ago, would it be possible to change the way we look at this and our prospects for moving forward if we saw Puerto Rico not as something that was the only problem we faced, but as a demonstration project to prove to the world that the combination of American government and American business can rebuild? You know, we're rebuilding our island, we'll show you what we can do, and we'll rebuild your island in the Pacific or in the Indian Ocean when it's your turn, and see it as if we succeed here, it's a market for us worldwide.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think Dante's statement about the Puerto Rico of the Caribbean is maybe even more apt than John Paulson meant it to be, because Puerto Rico actually has built in significant flood protection and floodplains and resilience measures to be able to put that many people onto a small island state. Puerto Rico could be the same sort of thing. I mean, you look around the world too. In New York and other places that are trying to be more resilient, the Dutch have decided to take it as a business measure to build in, to figure out ways to become more resilient and deal with water. We could do the same. You know, Puerto Rico could do the same. So there's no reason that this can't be.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
No, and I'm getting calls from as far away as Australia, and this is encouraging. And I think it's to your point about this being a big enough problem and opportunity that can draw in the private sector, the government, and investors. But I'm getting phone calls as far away as Australia. A company called Power Ledger, developing some really, really innovative platforms, leveraging blockchain to create a distributed solar meterless system that can be completely decentralized and sort of have this kind of energy resilience. I mean, this is very much at the cutting edge of technology, energy distribution, and people recognize that what happened in Puerto Rico is so devastating, and yet in it there is an opportunity to build back better. But any demonstration project we could create at scale, that resilience by design is not just academically interesting, but that you could do this for real. Puerto Rico creates a platform for that.
You bet.
Down in the front here, Adam, and then we'll go to the back.
Time is short a little bit with the piece on Disasters 4Rs. I think the best example that I like to use is I saw these images of basically coming out of Home Depot, small generators being deployed by aircraft, and that creates a dependency. It's only limited.
Right.
We were deploying using solar power with inspecting, but putting it on hurricane-proofed, putting on hospitals, putting on schools. It's immediate relief that then goes into recovery, reconstruction, helps the grid, lowering the prices, it's supporting competitiveness. And it's not just Puerto Rico. We should be looking around. I spent the 80s and 90s working on hundreds of these operations. It's an opportunity that we have. The price competitiveness of solar 20 years ago, very different today. That deployed electricity via solar can beat any other path to getting solar quickly to our region.
Hands down, no doubt.
Yeah, Steve, you talk about all the time how the Marines are deploying with solar packs.
Yeah, the
and-
example I use is a young Lance Corporal on the forward operating base who had to lug the batteries and diesel fuel up. He had to power all his communications equipment until somebody gave him a solar array. And all of a sudden, didn't need the diesel fuel, had rechargeable batteries. He was a happy camper. I mean, you could do that same example all over the island in Puerto Rico.
Department of Defense acquisitions has really prioritized these microgrids with renewable energy, and I think there's a good reason to think that they could be useful in these cases. Sir, back here, I think I saw, and then we're running close to out of time.
Yes, thank you. David Lewis with Manchester Trade and CSIS. We had an event 2 weeks ago on Irma. We had to sort of ratchet up now. We're having one tomorrow morning on Maria, so everyone's invited.
We beat you.
It's a team effort, and we're happy that there's more on this in town.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
anybody interested, just go to csis.org.
Yeah.
But before we leave, and I really appreciate what ASP is doing, by the way, you've done great work on your Cuba military program, which we follow closely. I think it'd be remiss, and it'd be an entire different session, really. What's the role and responsibility of the local state government in Puerto Rico? I'm a past Puerto Rico government official for 4 years. In those 4 years, about 450 incidents of public policy that I was responsible for. I had one where a federal official had to call me to attention. If we listen to everything you say today, it seems as if Puerto Rico is run by some dark office in the federal government, which it isn't.
Right,
The
right.
level of
Sure, of
autonomy and responsibility that we have on the island for all those issues you've mentioned, which are a problem. The 1950s socialist-style state corporations, not just PREPA, which is 9 billion, by the way, not 12, PRASA, which is the water, which is 4 billion, the University of Puerto Rico, which is 1 billion, and I'm a devotee of, and in my DNA. These are all local decisions we made with our autonomy and our responsibility. The 72 billion in debt, the same. The medical crisis, the same. You know, I could go on and on. You know, we just had an airport semi-privatization 4 years ago with a Mexican company. We almost had a civil war. And then when people found out it was the Mexicans who won it, you know what they started to say? The cartels are going to come in and take over. Now the airport is a wonderful operation, albeit it just got hit very hard, but it was running great after 30 years of just decline. So, you know, there's a lot that's been done just on island and that we haven't done, and it's not just the federal side. Jones Act. Everybody in this town is now an expert on the Jones Act in the past 2 weeks. I was in government. There were 2 generations before me who had to deal with the Jones Act, 2 generations after me. In the 70 years, there has never been one government of Puerto Rico position paper, should we stick or not stick with the Jones Act? Never. The private sector, the same thing. And we've got 2 Jones Act coalitions in town that work very, very well. One pro and one against the Jones Act. And we've been begging Puerto Rico for 20 years, guys, join anyone, any side. Flip a coin and join one. You can't be complaining that it's somebody up here in Washington who has us strangled with the Jones Act when we don't take a decision. Is the Jones Act good for us or is it not good for us? So hopefully now after this, people will really do, you know, there's like 28 studies, better, worse, whatever. People will look at it and there'll be a public policy decision by Puerto Rico to come to Washington and say, Washington, we want it repealed, we don't want it repealed. That's the problem. The people on the Hill don't know what to do because Puerto Ricans never said anything. So, you know, in the future, we need to really look at that. Final one. A lot of those little homes that have been destroyed, it's what we call, and you know, we work in this space, informal housing.
Right.
But it's all with permits. Permitted informal housing that got devastated. Below water, you know, near rivers and so on. And you know how they get permitted? You know, porque tu amiguito viene, okay, give me the permit, I paid you some money, my cousin and so on. That's not the federal government for crying out loud.
So-
Those are Puerto Ricans, so we need to take
Absolutely.
conscience.
So I think the gentleman brings up points close to home, and I appreciate the last line. I almost broke into pure Boricua up here on the stand. What you hit at, though, are two key issues. Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. are strange bedfellows for one reason. Ni voz ni voto. We have no voice and no vote in Congress. We have an observer mission in Congress. And if you want to tilt the political landscape, you've got to address the final status issue, because autonomy is great when everything is fine. When you need to be rescued, both for an economic reason or a crisis, we have members of, Puerto Rico's economy is being managed by Promesa, by a financial control board, not unlike DC's was, back in the 80s or 90s, right? And so all of the autonomy that you described may have been true once upon a time, but in a crisis of these proportions, with Promesa on top of it, forget autonomy. We have no autonomy. And until we have a voice and a vote in Congress and genuine value of citizenship at the individual level, none of the issues you described really matter in the long haul. Right now, we're still in a humanitarian phase of this crisis. There are things that we can do. I'd like to see one Puerto Rican show up who's on the island, defend the Jones Act. They don't exist. And if they do, they're the type of corrupt officials that don't belong in the 21st century in public office. But there is not a person on the island of Puerto Rico who's interested in that Jones Act, who's trying to improve the economy and rebuild their own household.
Yeah.
How many years ago did they say it was a Category 4? It hit 40 years or 50
at
years?
least, yeah.
My point being, this is a once-in-a-half-century opportunity.
Yep.
It is an opportunity. And I understand everything you're saying, and I think Dante understands better than I do, that maybe this is the time to get everybody together and say, okay, let's get together, let's work this way, try to stop the corruption, tough job to do. The feds will have to play a huge part in this. And, I mentioned earlier that it starts at the city, then a territory, and then a federal government. But a disaster of this magnitude requires federal help, and it's got to be there.
Yeah, I would just add, I'm a subscriber to the public choice theory of economics, which is that government has a big economic role and voice. And there was an economist here in Maryland named Mansur Olson, who wrote about how government kind of builds and builds and builds more. But then there are times when a crisis happens and it can clear away all of that sort of overgrowth of government and can allow for a rebuilding of growth and everything. And so maybe we're at that crisis point, and maybe that'll be what happens. With that, thank you all for coming. I know there may be a few more questions. We're happy to talk here afterwards. And thanks for your time. Go take a look at our website. Take some of our materials on
Contribute
this.
to ASP.
Contribute to ASP. And like General Cheney said, our next event will be with Secretary Hagel. So let us know if you're interested in something like that. Thanks very much.
Thanks.